Hi guys. Today, I want to tell you a quiet story. Not one of fame or fortune, not about triumphs that make headlines, but about love that carries weight and footsteps that refuse to stop. It's the story of a father whose back grew weary long before his heart did, and of a son who, for 9 years, never walked to school, but never missed a single day. If you've been searching for something calm, something tender, or just a moment of stillness to remind you that even silent efforts can shape a life, then this story might be what you need. The town of Glen Hollow sat nestled between gentle hills, shrouded most mornings in a veil of soft fog. It was a place where time moved slowly, where people greeted each other with nods instead of words, and where quietness was not a sign of absence, but a way of living. And in the quiet rhythms of Glen Hollow, one sight had become so familiar that many had stopped noticing it altogether. Every morning, just before the sun dissolved the pale mist clinging to the roads, a man would walk silently across the square. On his back was a boy, small, thin, legs dangling loosely as if in sleep, but eyes wide open, always fixed forward. The man's name was Thomas Rowe. The boy was his son, Elias. They lived on the outskirts of town, in a weathered wooden house, tucked at the foot of the hill. There was nothing remarkable about it, except for the warm glow from the window each night, and the smell of toasted bread that sometimes drifted all the way to the trail behind the property. Elias had been born with a rare neuromuscular condition. His legs could not support his weight. The doctors said he would live, but never walk. And then, when Elias was just shy of his 3rd birthday, his mother Judith passed away. Since then, it had always been just the two of them. Thomas wasn't an old man, but his face carried the stillness of someone who had walked through more than he ever told. He wasn't the kind to complain. He didn't ask for sympathy. When Elias reached school age, Thomas simply decided he would carry his son there, every day, every season, without fail. The elementary school sat nearly 2 miles away, along a dirt road that wound through uneven terrain. Some parts dipped into low slopes, others turned rocky and slick after rain. In the winters, snow would blanket the path and make each step heavier. But Thomas never missed a day. He walked slowly, steadily, one foot after another, Elias on his back, a backpack slung forward to balance the weight. At first, the townspeople whispered. Some suggested that Thomas apply for government support so his son could study from home. Others said he should invest in a wheelchair. Some were genuinely concerned. Some were just curious. Thomas never explained himself. Not really. He only said one thing. I don't want my son to just survive. I want him to grow, like every other child. Elias never questioned it. He simply knew that every morning his father would wake him gently and say, "Ready, son?" And each time he nodded, he was lifted, not just from the ground, but above the heaviness of shame, above the quiet stares from neighbors, above the fear that he was somehow lesser. On his father's back, Elias felt like he was walking. There was one winter, particularly harsh, when Elias fell ill with pneumonia. He missed almost 3 weeks of school. Thomas refused to leave the hospital, sleeping upright in the stiff armchair beside his son's bed, as if he could absorb the fever with the warmth of his presence. On the 5th night, Elias whispered, his voice hoarse and thin, "Dad, if I get better, I'll go to school on my own someday." Thomas didn't respond, but he held his son's hand tighter. When Elias finally returned to school, he brought with him a short essay titled, "The Person I Admire Most." It was clumsy in its grammar, scattered in thoughts like most children's writing. But there was a paragraph that made his teacher stop reading, hand pressed to her chest. "My dad doesn't know how to use a computer. He's not great at talking to people, but he is my legs. He carries me when I don't want to wake up. He carries me when I'm sad and I don't say anything. If anyone ever says hero, I think they're talking about someone like him." Thomas never read the essay. Elias didn't show it to him, but the teacher kept a copy, and in her hardest days, she would take it out and read it like a soft handwritten prayer. There were mornings when the rain came down in sheets, and Thomas would arrive soaked, his clothes clinging to his skin. But Elias would be wrapped in his father's coat, its edges stretched behind like a makeshift roof. There were days when Elias was quiet the whole way, lost in thought. Days when Thomas winced with every step, pain shooting up his back. But the next morning, he would rise just the same, open the door, lift his son, and start walking. It was not duty. It was love that needed no reason to repeat itself. By the time Elias turned 13, he had grown taller, heavier. Thomas developed a slight limp in his right leg. A nurse at the clinic suggested he rest more. "You could hire someone," she said, "or at least consider a pushchair." Thomas only smiled, his hand tightening slightly on his son's backpack. "I don't know how many more years I'll be able to carry him, but as long as I can, I won't stop." And maybe he didn't know how long he had. But in that moment, standing under the low winter sky, he told his son what he always told him. "We'll keep going, and maybe, if you've ever found yourself walking when it hurts, carrying weight no one else sees, then perhaps you understand something of this story too. And if this moment stays with you, even just a little, feel free to leave a like or subscribe." To Quiet Strength. There are more stories waiting here for when you need them most. In spring, Glen Hollow came alive in a quiet sort of way. Not with festivals or fireworks, just soft blossoms along the edges of the winding road, and the chirping of birds that returned without fanfare. It was during this season that Elias began noticing the weight of things. He didn't speak of it, not even to his father. But as he grew older, there were mornings when guilt crept in like a slow shadow. He could feel it in the way his father's breath came heavier by the time they reached the halfway point. He noticed the extra seconds it took Thomas to straighten his back after setting him down at the school gate. But Thomas never said a word. His "Ready, son?" came each morning with the same steady tone, as though time had never passed. One Monday morning, Elias lingered longer than usual before answering. "Do you ever get tired, Dad?" Thomas paused, adjusting the strap of the bag on his shoulder. "Of course I do," he said, then glanced at his son and smiled gently. "But not of carrying you." That was all he said. That was all Elias needed. At school, Elias had few friends, but those who knew him admired him quietly. He was thoughtful, observant, and had a calmness that felt older than his age. His teachers noticed he listened differently, not just to what was being said, but to how it was said. He paid attention to silences, to eyes that dropped away mid-sentence, to hands that fidgeted when someone was pretending to be okay. Perhaps that's what happens when you've spent your life on someone's back. You learn how to see from the heart, not just the eyes. Elias excelled in literature. Stories, he said once, were places where his legs didn't matter. In stories, he ran, danced, climbed trees. In stories, he was weightless. At home, Thomas had grown quieter over the years. He worked at the lumber yard during the afternoons, often returning with splinters in his hands and sawdust in his collar. He cooked simple meals, stew, rice, eggs, and always served Elias first. Sometimes at night, Elias would hear him shift on the old mattress, groaning softly as he tried to ease the stiffness from his joints. Once, he peeked into the room and saw his father massaging his calves with menthol cream, wincing quietly. Elias turned away and didn't mention it in the morning. He knew his father would only smile and say, "All good, son." In 7th grade, a writing competition was announced. The theme was Unseen Strength. Elias stared at the poster for a long time. That night, without telling his father, he began writing. He wrote every evening after homework, sometimes past midnight. It wasn't just about winning. He didn't care about prizes. It was something deeper, a need to give shape to something unspoken. 2 weeks later, he handed in the essay. It began simply. Every morning, my world begins on someone else's back. Itamida. When the results were announced, Elias didn't win first place. He didn't even place in the top 3. But 2 weeks after the ceremony, a man in a brown jacket came to their home. He was from a local newspaper. Said he had read Elias's piece after a teacher sent it in. Said it moved him. The next Sunday, the story was printed in the back pages of the paper under the column, Voices Worth Hearing. Thomas didn't speak when he read it. He folded the page carefully, tucked it between the pages of an old book, and said nothing. But Elias saw him touch it again the next morning, before placing it back on the shelf. By 8th grade, Elias had grown taller still, his body filling out. Thomas now walked with a limp that never quite left him. His back curved slightly to the right, a quiet testament to the weight of the years. Still he carried his son. Elias sometimes asked to be set down early to roll the last few meters in his chair. He did it to spare his father, but also, if he was honest, with a twinge of embarrassment. Teenage years are cruel like that. They teach you shame for things that once felt sacred. One morning, as Thomas reached the school gate, he felt Elias tap his shoulder. "Let me walk the last bit today," he whispered. Thomas set him down gently, unfolded the chair, and helped him sit. They said nothing else. But when Elias looked back from the door, his father was still standing there, hands in his pockets, watching with an expression that said, "I understand." That summer, Glen Hollow saw heavy rains, flooded roads, fallen branches, and a cold that came too early. One morning, Thomas slipped on the wet stone path behind their home. He didn't cry out, but Elias heard the sound, the sudden thud, the sharp inhale. He rushed outside to find his father sitting in the mud, ankle twisted. They sat there in the rain for a moment, saying nothing. Then Elias, soaked through, looked his father in the eye and said, "Let me carry you now." Thomas laughed softly, even as pain laced his voice. "You already do, son. Every day." That night, Elias wrote a letter. He didn't show it to anyone. Not yet, but it began. "You've walked through your pain so I wouldn't feel mine. And now I know. That is what love looks like." Autumn came with a hush. The wind in Glen Hollow shifted, cooler, crisper, laced with the scent of pine and smoke. Leaves fell in slow spirals, covering the path that Thomas and Elias took each day like a carpet of muted gold and red. It was Elias's favorite season. The quiet seemed softer. The air tasted gentler, but beneath it something unspoken lingered. Thomas's limp had worsened. It showed not only in his step, but in the way he paused longer at the bottom of the hill, in the way his breath shortened by the time they reached the school gates, in the way he would silently run a hand across his lower back when he thought Elias wasn't looking. Elias always noticed, but he said nothing. Not yet. Instead, he began, getting up earlier, dressing faster, adjusting his posture on his father's back so the weight wouldn't fall unevenly. He memorized the curves of his father's spine, the way Thomas favored his left foot, the rhythm of his stride. Love, Elias had learned, was often a silent adaptation. In literature class, Elias's teacher handed out an assignment. Write about a turning point in your life. Most students groaned. Elias stared at the blank page and thought of mornings soaked in rain. He thought of footsteps in snow, of how love didn't always sound like "I love you," but sometimes like "Ready, son." He titled his piece, "The Long Way to School." It wasn't grand. It wasn't tragic. Just honest. And in that honesty, there was beauty. When his teacher read it, she didn't comment right away. She simply put her hand on his shoulder and nodded. A quiet approval, the kind Elias had come to understand best. At home, Elias began cooking dinner more often. Simple things: eggs, soup, grilled cheese. Thomas never said much, but the way he sat a little longer at the table, or the rare moments he closed his eyes while chewing, those were thank yous. One evening, as Elias sliced carrots, Thomas stood in the doorway and asked, "Are you happy, son?" Elias paused, knife mid-air. He thought of his legs, of the years of being carried, of the stairs, the silence, the moments he'd wanted to disappear. Then he turned around and said, "Yes, Dad, I am." And he meant it. But happiness didn't mean there weren't hard days. There were still mornings when Elias woke up with an ache in his chest, a longing to be normal, whatever that meant. He sometimes watched the other boys play soccer and felt like he was watching a life behind glass, one he could never touch. But every time that ache surfaced, it was chased away by a memory of being lifted, of being carried, of being loved so completely that it outweighed the things he lacked. And that was enough. Not perfect, but enough. The final year of middle school arrived. Elias was 14. He had grown again. Taller now, shoulders broader, his arms starting to show definition. Thomas, by contrast, seemed to shrink a little. The slope of his shoulders deeper, the lines on his face sharper. One morning, halfway to school, Thomas stumbled. It wasn't a fall, just a sudden misstep, but it shook them both. Elias quickly slid down from his father's back, worried. "Are you okay?" Thomas caught his breath. Yes, just a misstep." But when Elias looked into his father's eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen before. Fear. That night, after dinner, Elias brought out a folded piece of paper. It was the letter he had written months earlier, the one he hadn't shown anyone. He placed it gently on the table. "Can I read you something?" Thomas nodded, leaning back. Elias's voice trembled slightly as he began. "You've carried me more than anyone should have to, but you never made it feel like a burden. You taught me that being strong doesn't mean never bending. It means standing back up, again and again, with love still in your hands. Dad, you are the reason I believe in goodness." Thomas didn't say anything for a long time after Elias finished. Then, quietly, he stood, walked to his son, and wrapped him in an embrace that said everything. From that day on, Elias began using his wheelchair more regularly. It wasn't a decision made with sadness, but with grace. He understood now. Accepting help, letting go of old habits, didn't mean giving up. It meant honoring the ones who had given so much. Thomas still walked with him every morning. But now, Elias wheeled himself down the path while his father walked. Beside him, hand on his shoulder. They talked more during those walks. About books, about life, about memories from years they had only survived by holding each other. Their journey hadn't ended. It had just changed shape. One afternoon, as they passed by the town square, a young woman approached them. She was a journalist, she said, doing a piece on local acts of kindness. Someone had mentioned their story. She asked for a photo, an interview. Thomas hesitated, but Elias smiled. "Only if it helps someone else feel less alone." The article was published a month later. Its title was "A Long Walk of Love." Beneath it, a picture. Thomas, standing beside Elias, one hand resting lightly on the wheelchair, both smiling into the autumn light. No poses, no pretense, just two people who had walked through every season together. Winter, when it returned to Glen Hollow, did so without apology. The hills were buried beneath drifts of snow. The wind howled through the bare trees, and the sun took its time rising. Everything moved slower. School days shortened, neighbors stayed indoors, and even the birds quieted. But the walks continued. Elias, now almost 15, had grown into the weight of his own story. The wheelchair creaked a little more on the ice-crusted path, and Thomas's steps, though steadied by years of habit, became shorter, more deliberate. But they still moved forward, always forward. And somehow, even in the harshness of cold, their small routines carried warmth. One Thursday morning, as frost traced lace patterns along the window panes, Thomas paused at the door, keys in hand. "Do you want to try going alone today?" he asked quietly. Elias looked up from his notebook. "What do you mean?" "I can follow behind, a little ways back, just to see." There was no pressure in his voice, just an offering. Elias stared at the doorway, at the dim light beyond it. For a second, the thought of navigating the icy street alone tightened in his chest. But then he looked back at his father, his worn coat, his steady eyes, his breath that had carried him through storms. And he nodded. "I can try." He went slow, carefully. The wheels crunched softly on the packed snow. The road he had traveled 1,000 times now felt different. Not because of the snow, but because his father's shadow wasn't just behind him. It was within him. A quiet presence that steadied him from the inside out. Thomas followed from a distance, hands in his coat pockets, eyes never leaving his son. Elias reached the school gate without incident. He turned, smiled, and gave a little wave. Thomas exhaled into the cold and smiled back. It was the smallest freedom, and the beginning of something bigger. That winter, Elias began doing more alone. Not because he didn't need his father, but because he understood him. He began pushing himself more, through the streets, through his thoughts, through the quiet self-doubt that had always trailed behind him. And in doing so, he found a new kind of strength, one built not on resistance, but on acceptance. But Thomas still carried the years in his spine. One morning, Elias woke early to find his father sitting on the edge of the bed, shoulders hunched, one hand gripping his thigh. "You okay?" Elias asked softly. Thomas looked up, surprised. "Didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," Elias replied. "But you don't have to do this alone anymore." Later that day, after school, Elias came home with a printed flyer. It was an ad for a second-hand motorized wheelchair. Not brand new, not flashy, but sturdy. "I've been saving up," Elias said, placing it on the table. "And there's a fund at school. They might help." Thomas picked up the flyer, hands rough with calluses. "It's okay to let the world help us too," Elias added gently. For the first time in years, Thomas's eyes filled. He nodded. Not because he was giving up, but because he was passing something on. Spring thawed the ice. Patches of green appeared beneath the melting snow, and birdsong returned to the town's early mornings. The road to school dried, and with it came a sense of renewal. The wheelchair arrived 2 weeks later. Elias grinned as he tested it on the gravel path. Thomas walked beside him, slower now, with a cane borrowed from a neighbor who had once broken his hip. They made quite the pair, one moving forward with whirring wheels, the other with worn leather shoes and a quiet limp. But together, they moved with rhythm, not of speed, but of companionship. One afternoon, Elias asked his father to visit the school. Not to pick him up, not to carry him, just to sit in the library. "I'm giving a talk," Elias explained. "About storytelling, and about journeys." Thomas wore a pressed shirt that day, shaved carefully. He sat in the back corner of the library as Elias spoke to a group of students. Elias didn't mention his disability. He didn't need to. He spoke instead about what carries us, about unseen strength, about the way love molds itself into the shape of our needs. And near the end, he said, "My father never gave a speech, but he gave me a path. He didn't teach me how to walk, but he taught me how to keep going." And because of that, this story isn't just mine, it's ours. Afterward, Thomas waited outside. Elias wheeled toward him, grinning. "You, proud?" he asked. Thomas's voice was husky. "Always have been. Always will be." They walked home together without a word, and in the silence between them, the story kept unfolding. Summer returned to Glen Hollow with its usual tenderness, not loud or boastful, but in soft winds that stirred the curtains, in the hum of bees over clover, and in the way the days stretched themselves open, lazy and long. Elias turned 15 by now. The morning walk had turned into something more like a ritual, not out of necessity, but of love. He used his motorized chair most days, gliding gently over the uneven path while Thomas walked beside him, now always with his cane. Their steps were slower, but the conversations deeper. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. They just listened. To birdsong, to the rustling trees, to each other's breath. There was something sacred about that silence. One morning, Thomas didn't come to the kitchen. Elias waited, then called. No answer. He found his father in bed, curled on his side, eyes open but unfocused. The doctor called it a severe strain, likely from years of overuse. He'd need rest, pain management, and likely physical therapy. "Can't walk with him for a while," the doctor told the nurse softly. But Thomas heard, and for the first time in a long while, he looked lost. Elias didn't say anything that night. He made soup, left it on the bedside table, and sat by the window. But inside, something stirred. Not fear, a calling. He pulled out a notebook and began to write. It was time. Elias had been keeping journals for years. Quiet notes to himself. Memories, thoughts, reflections. But now he began to turn them into something more. A story. Not fiction, not drama, just truth. Written slowly, tenderly, like a letter to someone who had never seen what it means to carry and be carried. He titled it, Shoulders of Love. He wrote every morning before school, and every night before sleep. Thomas, though recovering slowly, noticed the change. Elias looked lighter, not in body, but in spirit. When Elias finally showed him the pages, Thomas held them like something sacred. "This is yours," Elias said. "No," Thomas replied. "It's ours." As summer deepened, Elias submitted the manuscript to a small community press. He didn't expect anything. He just wanted it to exist, like the path they'd walked, like the quiet mornings, like the love that asked for nothing in return. 2 months later, the letter arrived. They wanted to publish it. The news rippled through Glen Hollow like a soft breeze. Neighbors who had once stared in silence now came with handshakes and quiet congratulations. The local bookstore, a cramped but charming place on Main Street, offered to host a small launch. Elias hesitated, but Thomas said, "Let them see, let them know." And so they did. The evening of the launch, Elias wore his nicest shirt, a pale blue one his father had saved for. Thomas wore the same pressed white shirt from the library talk. The bookstore was full, not just of books, but of people who had once passed them on the road in silence, now standing to listen. Elias spoke softly, his voice shaking at first. "I'm not here because of anything I've done," he began. "I'm here because someone refused to stop." Walking, he read excerpts, simple paragraphs about frost-covered paths, about the feel of wool against his cheek, about the way a hand on the shoulder could become a kind of lighthouse. No one moved. No one coughed. only silence. The heavy, beautiful kind. When it was over, an older woman approached them. "I used to see you both every morning," she said to Thomas. "I never said anything." "I should have." Thomas smiled gently. "You're saying something now." She pressed a hand to her chest. "You reminded me what real love looks like." Later that night, back at home, Elias placed the first printed copy of the book on the windowsill, right beside the old photograph of his mother. "I hope she's proud," he said quietly. "She would be," Thomas replied, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "She always was." School resumed in the fall, but something had shifted. Elias was no longer just the boy in the wheelchair. He was a voice, a storyteller, a bearer of something both fragile and indestructible. He began mentoring younger students, kids who struggled to find their place. He listened to them the way his father had listened to him. Not with answers, but with presence. And slowly, Glen Hollow, that quiet, tight-lipped town, began to soften. Not loudly, just enough. On the day Elias graduated middle school, the principal asked him to give the closing speech. He didn't talk about grades or tests or future plans. He talked about the journey, the one that wasn't on maps, that couldn't be measured in miles or milestones. Sometimes, he said, the person who carries you also teaches you how to carry yourself, and eventually, you learn to carry others too. The gymnasium, usually noisy, stayed silent long after he finished. That night, as they sat on the porch, Thomas passed Elias a small envelope. Inside was a note. "You've always been my reason to keep going, but now you've become someone else's reason too. I can rest a little now. Love, Dad." Elias folded the paper slowly, then reached over and took his father's hand. "I've got it from here." The final year of school came with its own quiet weight. Elias, now 16, had grown into himself. There was still the chair, still the scars of struggle, but they no longer defined him. What defined him was how he moved through the world, gently, attentively, like someone who had known the strength of being carried and had learned to carry others in return. Thomas, though older now and slower than ever, still woke up early each morning, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, waiting for the sound of Elias's wheels down the hall. Their conversations were softer, their silences deeper, and their bond somehow even stronger. One morning in early spring, Elias came in with an envelope. He placed it on the table without a word. Thomas looked at it, then up at his son. "You, open it," Elias said, voice steady. Inside was a letter, thick, embossed, and official. It was an acceptance. Full scholarship, university program in creative writing and communications. A place far from Glen Hollow. A place Elias had once only dared to dream about. Thomas blinked several times before speaking. "You're going," he said simply. Elias smiled, though something ached inside him too. "I don't know how to do it without you," he admitted. "You already have," Thomas said. The weeks that followed were filled with preparation. Paperwork, farewells, small moments that shimmered with finality. The night before Elias was set to leave, Thomas brought out a box, small, wooden, worn with age. Inside were mementos, a hospital bracelet from Elias's birth, a photo of Judith holding him as a baby, a folded map with a trail drawn in red ink from their home to the school, and at the very bottom, an old, fraying pair of gloves. "Your hands," Elias whispered. "They remember every step," Thomas said. "I want you to take them." Elias didn't speak. He only reached over and hugged his father tight, feeling the bones of a man who had shaped his life without ever asking for anything. In return, the day Elias left Glen Hollow was overcast. The neighbors gathered, quiet and warm. Some brought food, others brought hugs. A few simply stood at their porches and nodded, acknowledging not just the young man leaving, but the man who had raised him, carried him, believed in him. Thomas walked him to the bus stop. Slowly, deliberately, Elias's chair now had a pack slung behind it, books and notebooks peeking out like trusted companions. At the gate, Thomas bent down, not to hug, but to look his son in the eye. "You're not going alone," he said. "Every step you take, I'll be there, just like always." Elias swallowed hard. "And you?" Thomas smiled. "I've still got stories to read, maybe even write." They held hands for one last long moment. Then the bus door opened, and the journey began. The university was a world of its own. Bright buildings, wide paths, people from everywhere, and a sea of conversations Elias was still learning to join. At first, it was overwhelming. But then, one evening, in a quiet corner of the campus cafe, he took out his notebook and began to write again. Stories flowed, small ones, big ones, memories, moments, echoes of footsteps on snowy roads. And each word felt like a hand reaching back to hold his. Soon he began to share them. At first in class, then at open mic nights. Eventually, through a small blog he started called On My Father's Shoulders. People read, people responded. Not with noise, but with letters. Emails from strangers who saw themselves in his words. Children who had been carried. Parents who had carried. People who had forgotten what love could look like until they saw it written down. Back in Glen Hollow, Thomas read every post. He printed them out, kept them in a folder, showed them to neighbors, to the librarian, even to the barista at the tiny cafe on Main Street. "That's my boy," he'd say. And always, quietly, proudly, he'd add, "He carries the story now." Years later, when Elias came back to Glen Hollow for a visit, he no longer moved with the same fragility. His body was stronger, his chair more advanced, his spirit steady, rooted. Thomas, older now, sat on the porch waiting. They didn't need many words. That evening, as the sun dipped, behind the hills, they sat together watching the road they had once walked so many times, the same gravel, the same curve by the stone fence. Elias turned to his father. "You ever think we'd make it?" Thomas didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "I never thought about making it. I just thought about going, one day at a time." Elias nodded, and together, they watched the dusk roll in, wrapped in the kind of silence that needed no explanation. This story isn't about greatness in the eyes of the world. It's about the kind of quiet strength that never makes headlines. The man who gets up every morning and does what needs to be done, not for glory, but for love. Thomas Rowe didn't set out to be a hero. He didn't ask for attention. He simply carried his son, through storms, through stairs, through silence. And in doing so, he gave Elias more than mobility. He gave him a sense of self, of dignity, of courage. Elias, in turn, didn't let that sacrifice stop with him. He carried the story forward, in words, in action, in the way he held space for others, because that's what perseverance really is. Not just continuing in the face of difficulty, but transforming that difficulty into something meaningful. Sometimes we think strength has to roar, but often it simply walks. One step, then another, and then another, and maybe, just maybe, someone is walking because of the strength you once gave them.